Hi. Ooh. Let's try that again. That was a little strong. Hi. Let's try this. Hi. Let's talk God. Again. Hi, I'm David, and welcome back to COC. In the last episode, I asked you this all-important question. Do you believe in God? We started from a position of unbelief and looked at some of the major reasons why people don't. In this episode, as promised, we're going to shift gears, and now we're going to take a look at some of the major reasons why we Christians do. When you think about it, why would anybody want to believe in God, much less be a Christian? The whole system is backwards and very anti-establishment and counterintuitive to the world. I mean, the way up is down. Listen to some of the beliefs we have. God is all-powerful, but we have free will. How does that work? God is just, but He's also merciful. How can He be both? If you want to find fulfillment, or even find yourself, live for others. If you want to be rich, give. And what are we supposed to do with our enemies? Our sworn enemies who hate us? Bless them, pray for them, love them. None of this makes any sense. How the heaven are we supposed to square any of these circles? And these are just the internal things. Look at the external ones. Look at the persecutions believers have suffered throughout history. Even today, how many of us have been made fun of or been estranged from our own family and friends because we're believers? How many of us have been accused of being arrogant, controlling, elitist, judgmental, stupid, or something phobic? Needless to say, belief in God isn't necessarily easy and better than sex, drugs, and rock and roll. The reality that God is real is the ultimate inconvenient truth.
You can't handle the truth!
I very rarely ever share my conversion story or personal testimony of how I came to believe in God, because to be honest, I don't really have one. Now don't get me wrong, I of course believe in God and my faith is the most important thing in my life. But I never had a person or a major once-in-a-lifetime experience that convinced me. Okay. I don't know what the crap that was. Anyway, my simple story is that, as I've mentioned before, I was raised as a Christian. I then spent several years as a prodigal son, and I looked at other things. And then I investigated the faith, and eventually found my way back. As we talked about in the last episode, just like people who don't believe in God, people who do believe in God have a wide range of reasons for why they do. Some of the reasons are philosophical. Some of them are scientific. Some of them are anecdotal. Their faith is based on some mystical experience they've had with God. Whatever the reasons, whether they're personal or scholastic or something else, I can't tell you why every one of us believes that God exists. The best I can do is tell you why I believe God exists. And it's the same reason that I believe you do. In fact, it's the only reason that I believe anything exists. Evidence. How do I know you exist? Prove to me that you exist right now. You might tell me, well, you can see me. You can hear me, and you can feel me, especially if I give you a good smack.
Oh, wow! Wow!
To which I would respond, absolutely. I can see you, I can hear you, and I can definitely feel you, especially if you hit me. All of these things apply to God as well. We can see God, we can hear God, and we can feel God. Obviously not in the same ways, but we can do all of these things if we look at the evidence. Right now, I could be dreaming. I could be hallucinating. I could be living in the Matrix. Hence, I can never know for sure that you exist. But there's evidence that tells me that you do. Just like there's evidence that tells me God does. And because of this, I have faith in God. Yes. Another word for faith is trust. And trust is having a reasonable belief in something. It's not a 100% guarantee, but it's a likely probability. For example, I don't know that the ceiling isn't going to cave in on me right now. But I have faith, I trust that it won't. Do I know this for sure? No. But I have a reasonable belief, a likely probability, a preponderance of evidence that it won't. It looks pretty reliable. It's not leaking or anything. It's never caved in on me before. And I'm going to assume that the people who built it knew what they were doing. And to be honest, this is the way we all have to live life. By faith. Like I said in the last episode, we all have to have some kind of faith in certain axioms and presuppositions in order to even live life. And this faith is always based on a preponderance of evidence. And just like there's a preponderance of evidence that leads me to believe that the ceiling isn't going to cave in on me, there's a preponderance of evidence that leads me to believe in God. One important thing I want to mention here. I've heard many believers say over the years that they don't need evidence to prove God is real. They just believe in God based on blind faith. You know what's stupid? That. Hear me on this. Your faith never needs to be blind. Blind faith can often lead to blind obedience, and blind obedience is bad. Very, very, very bad.
Very bad. Very, very, very bad. Bad.
Blind obedience is what makes people drink the Kool-Aid. Literally. Blind obedience is what makes people commit mass suicide so they can hitch a ride on the Hale-Bopp comet when it flies by. Blind obedience is what makes people blow up World Trade Centers. I'll say it again. Your faith never needs to be blind. It needs to be based on evidence. So what is the evidence? Since extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, what is the actual evidence we have for God? Good question, campers. So here's a good answer. 2 words summarize why I believe in God: reason and revelation. This idea actually came from some of my Catholic friends, so there's a shout out to them. But I'm going to totally steal it from them because it's brilliant and it summarizes my thoughts perfectly. Reason and revelation. Let's look at them both individually. Number 1 is reason. How do we know God exists through reason? Well, simply put, because you and I have reason. As I mentioned in the last episode, we as people share DNA and the same genetic code with almost, if not every single life form. Animals, plants, bacteria, fungi. But we have one thing that none of them has: the capacity to reason. What is reason? Reason is actually a combination of things. Reason is wisdom. Reason is our ability to balance emotion and rationality, to blend our experience and intelligence, to combine our cognitive abilities and functions, to think counterfactually. Reason is the ultimate X factor that gives us human exceptionalism, that makes us special and unique. Riddle me this, Batman. If most, if not all, living creatures share DNA and the same genetic code, we all come from the same source, why are we as people the only ones to have a mind with the capacity to reason? What could possibly have gifted us, and only us, with this superpower? The most obvious explanation is the same source of the common creator we all come from, the supreme being we as Christians call God. Only God as the creator can determine what his creation is and isn't, and what his creation does and doesn't have. When unbelievers say they don't believe this, they don't believe that a supreme being we call God deliberately and intentionally created and designed them, including their mind. Kind of makes you wonder what makes them think that they can trust what they believe or think about anything. If they say they don't believe in God, they have disbelief in God, how can they trust their disbelief? Their disbelief was formulated in their mind. But if their mind is just a bunch of neurons that have aimlessly and randomly evolved over millions of years for apparently no reason whatsoever, how can they trust what they think? What if their neurons fire off differently tomorrow? How can they believe their disbelief? How can they not doubt their doubts? How can they not be skeptical of their skepticism? All of this comes from their mind, which according to them, we have no way of knowing we can trust. Even if they want to empirically test things to prove what's real and what isn't, how can they trust their mind to understand what they find? C.S. Lewis once said, "Supposing there was no intelligence behind the universe, no creative mind. In that case, nobody designed my brain for the purpose of thinking. It is merely that when the atoms inside my skull happen, for physical or chemical reasons, to arrange themselves in a certain way, this gives me, as a byproduct, the sensation I call thought. But if so, how can I trust my own thinking to be true? It's like upsetting a milk jug and hoping that the way it splashes itself will give you a map of London. But if I can't trust my own thinking to be true, of course I can't trust the arguments leading to atheism, and therefore have no reason to be an atheist or anything else."
Recent evidence that human beings actually seem to stand apart from all other creatures. It looks as if human beings uniquely have a quality called symbolism. We represent the world with symbols. We can manipulate those symbols and communicate them through language and music and art.
It's obvious that we as people are very different from other living organisms. And one of the main reasons for this is because God gave us, and only us, the capacity to reason. Why do we have reason? So we can use it to find God, to see how God has revealed himself to every single one of us. In other words, we have reason in order to see revelation. And how has God revealed himself to us? That brings me to my next point. Number 2, revelation. How do we know God exists through revelation? Revelation can be divided into 2 categories: private or special revelation, and then public or general, sometimes called natural revelation. What's the difference? Private revelation is when God reveals himself to an individual, or maybe even a group of people. Public revelation is when God reveals himself to all of us. And since I've never had a private revelation from God, at least not that I know of, Public revelation is the one we're going to talk about. How has God revealed himself to every single one of us? Over the centuries, many believers have come up with several ways to try to neatly explain and package this through various theological arguments. What's interesting to note about theological arguments is that they're all based on deduction, which means they're discovered, they're not created or invented. There are several theological arguments we could talk about here, but there are three that I want to showcase. The first theological argument we have for God is called the cosmological argument. This argument says that God reveals himself through causation. Everything with an effect has a cause. In other words, everything with an effect has a beginning, which means that everything around you right now came from somewhere, including you. You didn't give yourself your own existence. Think about it. How did you get here? Your parents had you. How did they get here? Their parents had them. How did they get here? Their parents had them. And on and on and on it goes. If you were able to trace your whole family genealogy all the way back to the very beginning, you'll have to find a starting point somewhere. There can't be an infinite regress of something finite. Everything with an effect has a cause or a beginning at some point, and it takes something outside of the thing to begin it. So, what caused everything? There was nothing, and then there was everything. How? Why? And what? What set everything in motion? What is the so-called theory of everything? It's what Aristotle called an unmoved mover, or an uncaused first cause. Something had to make this stack of dominoes start falling. We as Christians call this something God. But the critic says, not everything has a cause. This is just a philosophical claim that can't be supported by any empirical evidence. Okay, then show me something that caused itself. Show me anything that created or invented itself with no outside help. Come on. Think about it. How can nothing create anything? How can things like energy and matter spring out of nothing? Some critics try to say that the universe must have caused itself because the universe never had a beginning. I don't know who came up with this, but not even scientists who are unbelievers agree on this. Did the universe have a beginning? Some of them say yes, some of them say no, and some of them say I don't know. Okay, glad we got that one solved. Let's look at what we do know. We have lots of evidence that tells us the universe had a beginning. And keep in mind that this isn't my personal opinion. This is what science says. We have the abundance of light elements, we have the cosmic microwave background, and we have universal expansion. The universe is expanding, which means it had to have started somewhere. Where did it start from? How did it start? Once upon a time, a Christian and an atheist were having a debate. At one point, the atheist said to the Christian, "You Christians are like the kid who comes downstairs on Christmas morning, sees presents under the tree and says, 'Oh look, presents are under the tree. That means Santa Claus exists.'" And the Christian said to the atheist, "You atheists are like the kid who comes downstairs on Christmas morning, sees presents under the tree and says, 'Oh look, presents are under the tree. They must have randomly exploded themselves into existence and put themselves there.'" Now, you and I can debate about who put the presents under the tree, but good golly Moses, we should be able to agree that somebody did. Saying that the presents came out of nowhere or somehow made themselves is just all kinds of stupid.
The Kalam cosmological argument is an argument that can be simply formulated. Premise one, whatever begins to exist has a cause. Things don't come into being from nothing. Two, the universe began to exist. There's good philosophical and scientific evidence that the universe is not eternal in the past, but had a beginning. And from that it follows, three, therefore, a cause of the universe exists.
The second theological argument that we have for God is called the teleological argument. This argument says that God reveals himself through design and purpose. So not only did God start everything, he designed everything to work in particular ways too. I don't think we realize what a miracle, and yes, I'll use that word, a miracle human consciousness is. You and I have this material body, but we have this immaterial soul that animates our body. Where did this soul come from? Before we even think about evolution, where did life come from at all? Millions and millions and millions of years went by and nothing, and then all of a sudden, boom goes the dynamite. There's people. Earth suddenly became the Goldilocks planet, the oasis in the middle of the desert, where the conditions and the constants, the design, were just right for human life to begin and flourish. How? From the most distant objects in outer space that we can see with a telescope, to the smallest cells we can see under a microscope, we find design. There can't be a building without a builder, a watch without a watchmaker, and there can't be a design without a designer. It amazes me how some critics think that because we have microscopes and telescopes, that means God doesn't exist. What the crap kind of bullcrap is that? Microscopes and telescopes just show us what the design is, not that there's no designer. Scientist John Lennox put it this way: as if using a microscope on a Rembrandt painting could disprove the existence of Rembrandt himself. In other words, I guess if we can see a Rembrandt painting through a microscope or a telescope, that means Rembrandt never really existed, and that painting just painted itself. Think about this. If there was no design to anything, we couldn't even study science, because we can't study anything that doesn't have some kind of order or structure. The fine-tuning, the functional complexity, the mathematical precision of the universe, none of this could be studied by any of us. Albert Einstein once said, "The most incomprehensible thing about the universe is that it is comprehensible." We also find design and purpose in things we can't see. Transcendental things like truth, beauty, goodness, and love. The scientific method is a great way to explain things, as long as we realize that some things can't be explained scientifically.
How do you know you're not deluding yourself? I mean, for me, I need proof.
Proof. Did you love your father?
What?
Your dad, did you love him?
Yes, very much.
Prove it.
Like I mentioned in the last episode, one of the reasons we only believe in one God and not many is that because if there were multiple gods and goddesses, we would have pandemonium all the time because they would fight each other. There has to be something that coordinates all the moving pieces in this master plan called life so that they all work together. We as Christians call this something God. But the critic says, you may see design and purpose in some things, but what about other things? What about things like evil, death, disease, injustice, pain and suffering, poverty, racism, sexism, natural disasters? Either there is no design in everything, or there's some design flaws. This is actually a fair question. In fact, it's something that I wondered about when I was flirting with atheism a few years ago. However, here's the way to look at it. God created the world perfect, but we as people messed it up. We were given a perfect car, but we turned out to be some pretty bad drivers, and we wrecked it. When we wrecked the world, all the bad stuff was introduced. Evil, death, disease, racism, natural disasters, all the rest. Now the world is broken. But just because it's broken, that doesn't mean that we can't still live in it. And that's because the ultimate design and purpose of the world is still here. We've just made it harder, and instead of being healthy and strong, now the world has a broke leg. However, the car may have been wrecked. The fender may be bent. The alignment may never be the same. The electrical system may work sometimes and not others. But the car can still get us from point A to point B. And that's the way the world is now. Broken, but still drivable. And what's the alternative here? If we as people had never been given the free will to choose wrong and wreck the world, we'd all just be a bunch of mindless robots. Is that what unbelievers would prefer instead? We're all just a bunch of mindless robots? Free will is not an illusion, campers. It was given to us by God. Otherwise, none of us could ever be held accountable for anything we ever do. God gave us, as people, free will, and we used our free will to wreck the world. But, despite what we've done to the world's ultimate design and purpose is still here. It's always funny to me when unbelievers say that they don't believe this. They don't believe that the universe and the world ever had a design and a purpose. Well, I guess then we all just need to be really glad that all of these things just magically figured out how to work before we got here. Just like how all of these random words I'm saying right now magically figured out a way to come together and make sentences. I guess we're all just really, 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 really lucky to have gotten here when we did. What a nice coincidence.
Do you realize that DNA actually cries out, in the beginning, God? In the beginning, the Creator. Because there's no way DNA could come about by natural processes.
The fine-tuning argument has been the go-to argument of Christians to prove that there's a God that's performing miracles, not just from beyond space and time, but within space and time. Literally over 1,000 different features of our Milky Way galaxy, our planetary system, our moon, the interior of the Earth, the life on the Earth, must be extraordinarily fine-tuned to make possible the existence of human beings on planet Earth.
The third theological argument we have for God is called the moral or the natural argument. This argument says that God reveals himself through morality. So not only did God start everything and design everything, God establishes certain rules for everything to live by. Every person has a conscience, an ethical code, an objective morality that intuitively tells us that some things are right and some things are wrong. Every human culture known to man has had some type of morality. Among other things, they've had laws to protect life, condemn stealing, and govern marriage and family relationships. But how do we instinctively know that some things are just good and some things are just bad? The famous theologian I quoted earlier, C.S. Lewis, was an atheist early in his life, but he eventually became a very devout believer. And he said the tipping point for him was the moral argument for God. He said, My argument against God was that the universe seemed so cruel and unjust. But how had I got this idea of just and unjust? A man does not call a line crooked unless he has some idea of a straight line. What was I comparing this universe with when I called it unjust? How can God allow so much pain and suffering in the world? Well, who says pain and suffering are bad? There has to be some standard of good, something, in order for anything to be called bad. We as Christians call this something God. But the critic says, morality is just a social construct. We as people create morality because it helps ensure our survival. It's just common sense. Okay, then please tell me what happens when we disagree about morality. What happens when some of us think certain things are good and some of us think they're bad? What makes your morality better than mine, or vice versa? Is there not some transcendent referee or umpire who's keeping score to tell us who wins? Or is morality just popular opinion? We just take a vote, which means certain things can be good today, but if enough of us change our minds, they can be bad tomorrow. This is actually a great selling point for atheism. If morality is determined by majority vote, we can convince enough people to change it every once in a while so that we never have any negative repercussions for anything we ever do. We'll never get pulled over for speeding if we can keep changing the speed limit. No wonder it's easier to be bad than good. The famous atheist Friedrich Nietzsche, the patron saint of postmodernism, once said, "Facts is precisely what there is not, only interpretations." This is a famous quote of his. There are no facts, only interpretations. Well, my obvious question to him would be, is that a fact, what you just said? Because if there are no facts, then what you just said isn't a fact either, right? Here's another brain teaser from him. Truths are illusions, of which one has forgotten are illusions. Another famous quote of his. There are no truths, only illusions. Again, my obvious question to him would be, is that true, what you just said? Because if there's no such thing as truth, then what you just said isn't true either, right? This kind of moral relativism is extremely dangerous because it's what gave us places like Auschwitz. But, as far-fetched as it sounds, there are actually unbelievers out there who not only agree with Nietzsche, they go even further than he did, and they argue that we don't even need morality at all. They say, how are we supposed to have any fun and enjoy life if we're living under a divine dictatorship? Here's what I always want to say to that. We're going to have to live under something, some kind of morality. So if you don't like living under a divine dictatorship, as you put it, are you saying you would rather us live under yours? We're going to have to live under somebody's. So you must think you've got a better idea. The obvious problem with this is what happens if the rest of us don't agree with your dictatorship. Now what? Who wins?
Well, the moral argument, a lot of people, I guess I would be among them, are very strongly inclined to think that if there weren't any such thing as God, you might say a divine lawgiver, then there really wouldn't be any such thing as moral obligation, genuine moral obligation. It's being the case that you really ought to do something or else really ought not to do that thing. There wouldn't be any such thing if there weren't such a person as God. But clearly there is moral obligation.
In addition to these three theological arguments, I'm going to add another one here because I think it's something that God has also revealed to all of us. And it's one of the main reasons that I came back to belief in God. The limit of unbelief. I also mentioned this in the last episode. Unbelief isn't very satisfying because it can only take us so far. For one thing, how can unbelief explain the paranormal or the supernatural? Things like miracles, ghosts, predicting the future. I want to ask unbelievers, are you really sure this is all there is? There's nothing else. Do you realize that if one paranormal or supernatural event in the history of humanity is true, that proves there's more than this? Forget trying to prove all the paranormal or the supernatural claims out there. If we can just prove one of them, that shows there's something else.
They're here.
Also this, how can unbelief explain things like people who say that their faith stopped them from suicide, or helped them overcome an addiction, or save their marriage? I've never heard one person say, my spouse and I were going to get divorced, but we stayed together because of our strong faith in nothing. One important thing I want to mention here, I obviously believe in God, but I owe a debt of gratitude to a lot of unbelievers. Why? Because they forced me to dig deeper. I decided years ago that if I really want to take my faith seriously, my faith can't be shallow. I actually still listen to some atheist channels and podcasts from time to time. People like Alex O'Connor, The Atheist Experience, Genetically Modified Skeptic, and Rationality Rules. I even read several books from the New Atheist crowd, like The God Delusion by Richard Dawkins and The Portable Atheist by Christopher Hitchens, the Hitch himself. To their credit, these unbelievers are super smart, and they ask some super smart questions. Because of this, I owe them a debt of gratitude. They forced me to dig deeper, and now I'm convinced that God is real. So let's summarize, campers, why I believe in God. Reason and revelation. Like I said before, we have reason in order to see revelation. We as Christians believe in something that creates us and sustains us. Something gives us life, and then equips us with all the things we need, internally and externally, in order to live life. We all know deep down inside that there's something. There's something that caused all of this to happen. Something that's coordinating all the moving pieces in this master plan called life. We all know that there's something, and we as Christians call this something God. There's a lot more evidence we have for God that I didn't mention, mainly for the sake of time. The reason I mentioned what I did is because it's the most popular evidence we have for God. But make no mistake, this is by no means an exhaustive list. The critic says, well, if it's so obvious that God exists, if we all have the intrinsic desire to believe in something beyond us, and if all the evidence is there, then why don't we all believe in God? Here's my response to that. You tell me. I think it's blatantly obvious that God is real. In fact, I just told you why I believe in God, and I never even opened the Bible. You know why? I don't have to. The preponderance of evidence for God is everywhere. If you can look at all the evidence we have for God, if you can look at reason and revelation, if you can look at the cosmological, teleological, and moral evidence, if you can look at the paranormal and the supernatural evidence, if you can look at all the arguments we have for things like causal finitism, contingency, irreducible complexity, perfection, ontology, psychophysical harmony, proper functionalism, transcendentalism, not to mention the fact that we all do have an intrinsic desire to believe in something beyond us. If you can look at all of this evidence and a lot more, and you still say that you still don't believe in anything, you know what that tells me? That tells me you don't want to. What's really going on here? This doesn't seem to be a lack of evidence problem. This seems to be a I just don't want to believe problem. Like I said in the last episode, unbelievers have a wide range of reasons for why they don't believe in God. Maybe they don't like being told to do. Maybe they're afraid of God. Maybe they're mad at God. Maybe they have an agenda. Maybe they had a bad experience with a believer, or maybe with religion in general at some point in their life. Maybe they were raised as a believer, but they made some bad life choices that led them astray. Or maybe they dated or got married to somebody who led them astray. Or maybe they went off to college and some professor got in their head and led them astray. I don't know what their motivation is, but I know what mine is. And it should be the same as yours. God is real, and He tells us as believers to tell the whole world about Him. Do you dare to believe? I dare you to believe.
Number one, God is the best explanation of why anything at all exists, rather than just nothing. Two, God is the best explanation of the origin of the universe at a point in the finite past. Three, God is the best explanation of the applicability of mathematics to the physical world. Four, God is the best explanation of the fine-tuning of the universe for embodied conscious life. Five, God is the best explanation for the objectivity of moral values and duties. And finally, six, the very possibility of God's existence implies that God exists.
Before we land this plane, I want to share with you some helpful resources. If you're trying to build a firm or firmer foundation for your faith, and I hope and pray that we all are, I couldn't recommend any of the books on this list more strongly. These people have a lot of intellectual firepower, and they can explain all of this a lot better than I can. I hope you enjoyed this because that's all I've got for now. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe. We'll talk again soon. But before you go, take this with you.